Here we go with late antiquity. We're talking about the fall of Rome, the division of the Roman Empire, and we're also going to be discussing Islam. So, in the year 330, AD 330 or BCE 330, whichever one you prefer, Constantine established a new urban center on the site of the old Greek city of Byzantium. Years later, the city was named Constantinople for its founder. Rome, in many ways, was no longer a practical site for the capital for a few reasons. One, it was too far from the center of military actions on the borders. As also, we have to take into consideration Rome being a very old city, referred to as the Eternal City. There are a lot of old families there. Rome's nobility has been around for generations, and they've had power for generations. So the Roman nobility being firmly established in the city of Rome makes the emperor's life rather difficult. Constantinople, all of its perks included that it could be easily defended, and it could prosper quickly since it was located along eastern trade routes. This eastern move left the western provinces increasingly vulnerable, especially to attack from Germanic tribes to the north. So Constantine dies in AD 337, and the following emperors, in an attempt to preserve what they have, among other reasons, they begin to invite those who live outside of Rome, the so-called barbarians. Remember, anybody who's not Roman is barbarian. And then, of course, they mistreat them. So, the Visigoths were one of the first tribes to accept the invitation to live within the Roman Empire. And the Romans, once again, treat them terribly, giving the Visigoths land that couldn't be farmed. They raped their women and then forced them to sell their children into slavery for food. And the Visigoths are not going to take this kind of treatment for very long, I'm sure you can imagine. Starting in AD 376, we see one so-called barbarian tribe really instigating the invasions of the Roman Empire. The Huns were from Mongolia in Asia, who settled in the area known later as Hungary. The most famous Hun warrior was their leader Attila. Attila was so furious in his attacks that he earned the nickname Scourge of God. And if you think back to how Jesus was whipped, if you consider the whipping that Jesus received before the crucifixion with the cat of nine tails, this is not a whipping that you're going to necessarily be able to stand up from later on. This is the type of whip that has sharp implements attached to it, literally ripping flesh away from the body. So when you think of scourge, think of that. So he is the scourge of God. Even the fierce Germanic warriors were afraid of the Huns. Attila wound up conquering and pillaging his way through Eastern and Central Europe. The Eastern emperor of the Byzantine Empire was paying Attila an amount, paying him a tribute, basically, to keep the Huns from attacking his empire, but eventually he could not keep up the payments. So Attila, of course, invaded the Eastern or the Byzantine empires. In about 447, he led his horsemen to take over Balkan land, attacking Greece, as well as threatening Constantinople. He then moved on to the Western Roman Empire, and in 450 he demanded to marry the Western Emperor's sister, and also receive half of the Western Roman Empire as her dowry, as the payment that would come with her as a bride to her new husband. But the Western Emperor Valentinian refused. To enforce his demand, Attila went on to attack Gaul, which is like modern-day France, part of the Western Roman Empire. But the Romans and the, again, so-called barbarians stopped his attacks in 451. The next year, 452, Attila and his horsemen crossed the Alps to invade Italy, which caused, and this is something I'd like for you to keep in the back of your mind, Pope Leo the First. Pope Leo the First, with Attila's invasion of Italy, Pope Leo the First paid money to Attila in order to save Rome from a total onslaught. The next year, 453, Attila the Hun died unexpectedly at the age of 47 on his wedding night because he was allegedly murdered by his new bride, a Burgundian princess. After that, his empire began disintegrating, but his impact on Europe was so strong that Attila the Hun appears as the villains in many epic Germanic poems. In the year 378, we see the Visigoths attacked, and just when the Romans thought they had won, the Visigoth cavalry rode in and ultimately smashed the Roman infantry. It was a decisive victory for the Goths, and several years later, in the year 410, the Visigoths sacked the city of Rome. Even though the capital had moved several times over, Rome was still called the Eternal City. It was something no Roman thought could happen. It's been a long time since anyone has invaded or attacked the city of Rome. The Visigoths soon left Italy and went on to settle in Spain. An emperor did remain in the west, but the Western Kingdom had pretty much dissolved, and Constantinople became the new Rome. It's difficult to pinpoint the exact time or reason for the fall of Rome. There are several problems. We have a decreasing population, economic problems, civil wars, and of course the invading barbarian tribes. So you can see from here that there are several different tribes of Germanic peoples that are traveling in from the east, from the north, and they are invading different areas. So let's look here. We have the, sorry for the movement. We have up here, okay, so for example, the Jutes coming in from the north, the Angles and the Saxons start making their way over to Britain. We have the Visigoths, again, coming down from the north and also making their way in over here from the east, and they come down, they sack the city of Rome, make their way over here to Spain. The Huns, represented by this line, they're coming in. There's Germanic invaders all over the place. Very, very difficult to respond to that. So let's go back a little bit to understand the culture of Germanic peoples, at least what we can know. The earliest tribes did not write, so we really only have archaeological sources as well as the writings of Romans, which are going to be biased, that we can use for evidence as to how they lived. It seems as if Germanic settlements were based on clans or families which were joined in kinship groups. A clan's greatest measure of wealth, seemingly, was the amount of cattle. Men cared for cattle while tending crops, ironworking, and fighting. Women were responsible for some agricultural labor, but mostly they made pottery and textiles while taking care of the household and as well as taking care of the sick and injured. Women we see are treated differently in nearly every culture we come across, and that is true for the Germanic peoples as well. Germanic women could own property, and they even received a share of their husband's wealth upon marriage. So it's not the idea of a woman giving a dowry and basically you're paying a man in order to marry this girl, right? Okay. Anyway, but women were also thought to have the gift of prophecy. So men often consulted female elders about important decisions. They did have a fair share of independence, but this was mostly because men had as many wives and concubines as they could afford. So men weren't necessarily always around. But this, once again, it does give rise to much more independence for Germanic women. these were not an overly nomadic people. It's not the same as what we see as the tent dwellers in the Middle East, but moving was definitely a part of life. It seems that they were sort of addicted to fighting. One, for the treasure that they could get, and also for the fame that they could achieve. So in many ways, this Germanic society represents the heroic society of Greece more than any other society we've studied or will study. Just like Homer wrote the Odyssey and the Iliad, we do have Germanic poets recording these epic poems about these fantastic heroes, such as the poem Beowulf, which recants the story of a German warrior hero who defeats the monster Grendel. The Germanic people were pagan, as all people are, unless they know the true God. But eventually they were introduced to Christianity. However, there was a widespread heresy, and heresy is a word you need to be familiar with. So if you don't remember it from our discussion on early Christianity, go back and review. There's a widespread heresy among the Germanic peoples that when they adopted Christianity, many of them adopted this particular heresy known as Arianism, which claims that Jesus was not God, but created by God. So one of the fundamental Christian beliefs is that Jesus is both God and man. He is not more one than the other. He is fully God and fully man. It's one of those great mysteries we cannot quite understand. So Arianism comes in and says, well, no, Jesus was not God. He was created by God. This heresy, which negates the divine nature of Christ, really caused quite a stink in the early church, and Constantine in particular wanted to put an end to it. So in 325, Constantine called the Council of Nicaea, a group of church leaders, to establish the Christian doctrine of the nature of Christ. So the Nicene Creed, a very, very important document, which comes from the Council of Nicaea. The Nicene Creed is an important document that emphatically states the nature of Christ as being God, and the nature of God being in three persons, what was later referred to as the Trinity. So Jesus is both God and man. The Nicene Creed affirms Christ's divinity as well as his human nature, and it also affirms the existence of one God in three persons: God the Father, God the Son, who is Jesus, and God the Holy Spirit. There was a very little difference in the people after accepting Christianity. For the most part, you see Germanic peoples continuing to fight. They're still very warlike. And when you convert to Arian Christianity, you're really not converting to Christianity. You're a part of a cult, right? But as time progressed, these beliefs became really entwined with their ethnic identity, which ultimately will hurt the relationship with Orthodox Christian believers. Although supposedly converted to Christianity, these people, once again, still very warlike. They committed atrocities against others, and it's going to cause further problems for the Western Kingdom. As these tribes encroached on Roman borders, the Western Kingdom had to figure out a way to defend the borders without breaking the bank. It costs a lot of money to fund your military. The treasury did not have enough money to pay its soldiers or mercenaries for a year's worth of service. So the government in the West established federate treaties with many tribes. A federate was an ally of Rome. And with this treaty, a Germanic tribe could live inside the empire as long as they fought Rome's enemies. So you help me, I help you kind of thing, right? The Visigoths became federates for enough grain to feed their families, and in return were able to fight their long-standing arch nemesis, as it were, the Vandals. Under the treaties, the tribes could even maintain their own culture and even their own governments. However, even with protections and liberties, Germanic people continued to war against each other and the Romans. In the year 407, Rome recalled legions of soldiers from Britain to help defend Italy from invaders, which left Britain without a strong military force and leads to Rome losing the Isle of Britain. North Africa fell away when the Vandals, who were Federates there, broke away and established a separate kingdom. So we see Rome continuously, the Roman Empire, especially in the West, continuously losing provinces. So here we are. We're back to the fall of Rome. Some historians argue that Rome did not, in fact, fall, but it just merely transformed. Rome was still in existence. There is a Western Empire and an Eastern Empire, the West and the East. The Eastern Kingdom was still able to rule effectively, but the Roman Empire underwent a major shift. The empire was transformed largely due to the high number of Germanic immigrants that lived among the Romans. Germanic focus was on rural living, so Romans eventually followed suit, and infrastructure began to deteriorate because they're not focusing on city living anymore. The Germans also experienced change from their interactions with the Romans. We have several converting to Christianity, and they began speaking Latin-derived languages. So this is why Southern European languages such as French, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, Romanian, these are referred to as the Romance languages because they are based on the Roman language. We also see the Germanic peoples settling down with new political structures. And instead of having tribes, they now have kingdoms. So I think that's a good place for us to stop for now, and we will pick up next time with these Germanic kingdoms.